I've just been informed by a reliable source that this is heaven, and we've all made it. Live from the KJLL studios, here is your host, Jake Feinberg.
Folks, welcome to a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. My guest today is Nat Hentoff. Nat, welcome to the program. My guest today is Nat Hentoff. Nat, welcome to the program.
Hello.
Hello, Nat. How are you?
What happened to this? We seem to be disconnected.
We are not anymore. We are not anymore. It's so nice.
Okay, let's go.
Yes, Nat, how much progress have we made in this country in terms of race relations since the last great civil rights push in the decade of the mid-'60s?
We have so far to go. Increasingly, among fellow reporters, friends, news analysts, all kinds of people, I hear that this has become a post-racial society. My gosh, we have a black president. There are more blacks in Congress. More school superintendents are in Congress. Not in Congress, but running the few school systems. The point is, however, and I'll start with some very recent news breaks. First is the Missouri Attorney General. This was from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch a couple of days ago. Dig this. African Americans in Missouri are more likely to be stopped and nearly twice as likely to be searched as white drivers. Hispanic drivers more than twice as likely during a traffic stop as their white counterparts. Then, almost on the same day, Chicago Tribune, the Illinois chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, filed a complaint. They went to the Federal Department of Justice. That's run by Eric Holder, who is a black man.
Yes.
I don't think he's much of a civil libertarian, but that's another story. Anyway, they filed a complaint asking, finally, to ban these so-called consent searches. You know, an officer will target a minority driver for a search during traffic stops. Sometimes, in fact, in that state, African Americans, as they put it, and Hispanics 2 to 3 times more likely to be searched. Now, they don't go to a court for a warrant. They have no, as they say in legal terminology, articulable reason to make this anti-Fourth Amendment stop. It's just because the guy looks black or Hispanic. Now, where I'm talking from, New York City, we have a police commissioner, Raymond Kelly, who has very high ratings throughout the 5 boroughs, except in some neighborhoods. And he's being touted to become the next FBI director because Raymond Mueller's term runs out in a couple of months. Ray Kelly, and I've been writing about this for years, is the champion stop and frisker police commissioner in the country. The New York Civil Liberties Union has brought lawsuits about this. Other groups have. I'm not exaggerating. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of New Yorkers walking on the street, especially in certain neighborhoods, black or Hispanic, get stopped and searched. Again, no warrant, no going to a judge. They just look black or Hispanic. And some people have been, there are various professionals I know, black professionals, that's happened to them maybe 8 or 10 times. And finally, after much pressure, the city council said, well, you got to give us an accounting of this every once in a while. Well, that's not much help because the education mayor, as he calls himself, Michael Bloomberg, has never said one word, and I'm not exaggerating. I've been covering the schools here, for decades, and all through his term, he has never said one word that this is one of the most segregated public school systems in the whole country, New York City. Now, we thought, a lot of us thought, in 1954, when the Supreme Court had its historic decision, Brown versus Board of Education, it was unanimous, although Chief Justice Earl Warren had to do a little forcing to get that to be unanimous, but they finally said any form of racial discrimination, segregation in public schools is inherently unconstitutional. What happened after that Supreme Court decision is that other federal courts, including the Supreme Court, kept cutting into that. And the result is, not only in New York City, in practically every large city and even smaller cities around the country, we still have largely segregated schools. There was one case that might have made a big difference. It was out of Michigan, called Milliken versus Bradley. And that was a case that finally ensured, until we have a different Supreme Court, that this public school segregation would continue. Now, it's not what they call de jure segregation. It's not done by law. It's done by where people live. It's done by residential voluntary segregation. So what happened after Brown v. Board of Education, a lot of white folks in a lot of places, and this continued for a long time, they decided they didn't want their kids going to an integrated school, so they moved to the suburbs. So what happened in the suburbs resulted in more segregated public school cities. And what happened in Milliken versus Bradley, there was an attempt to break through the usual suburban city boundaries.
Nat,
make it all
Nat,
one. Hello?
I just wanted to interject one thing. I have a question. Why, as a people, are we afraid to look at each other and realize what our country has become? We talk about traffic stops, the Hispanics being more likely to be pulled over, the blacks being more likely to be pulled over, the segregated schools. Why are we separating ourselves? Why are we getting farther and farther away from who we are as people? Are we less secure as a people?
Oh, boy. You're talking about what I spend all my time writing about.
Go ahead.
I would add to that question, which is a very integral question. How come most Americans, if they know what's in the Constitution at all, and many do not, realize that under Bush and Cheney, and even more so under Barack Obama, we've been losing more and more of our individual constitutional rights against the government, not only in the Bill of Rights, but most importantly, nothing is more important than your individual rights, but as important, there was a big debate in the Constitutional Convention in 1767, and the big question was, how much power are we going to give to the one president? And they finally decided on what is in the Constitution, separation of powers. But Bush and Cheney, and then Obama, have disregarded that almost entirely in some areas. They do not stop to ask Congress to do certain things or ask judges. I'll give you an example. Increasingly, under Barack Obama, it started with Bill Clinton, it got worse with Bush. When a case comes to court that might expose what the administration, the executive branch, is doing to the Constitution, putting people in prison indefinitely, all kinds of violations, all of a sudden, good old Eric Holden now goes to the court or sends somebody and says, hey, you can't listen to this. You can't even look at the evidence. It's a state secret. I'll tell you something. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, all those people who otherwise disagreed on a lot of things never imagined we would have a United States where the guy in charge at the Oval Office can say, stop it, you can't hear this case, it would endanger national security, just don't listen. And most judges agree. A few judges in the minority on a case will say, hey, what's going on? But their brothers and sisters say, no, we have to keep that. So the question is, how come people don't care about this? They don't care about the fact that there's so much segregation left, not only in the schools, but that when I was a kid, there was a phrase that some of my black friends use. They'd say, you got to watch out when you're driving while black. That becomes, if not a felony, pretty close to it. Most Americans and I'm generalizing, which I try not to do when I write, but let's say many Americans are ignorant, denotatively ignorant of why they're Americans. American history is hardly taught anymore in the schools. What's taught now is how to teach for the tests so that the teachers and the principals can keep their job.
Right.
But there's not any time left for American history in most places. And what about civics? When I was a kid, you'd learn something about why we have a Constitution. You know, when I go around to schools, whether it's fifth graders or graduate students, no matter what I'm supposed to talk about, I tell them stories. That's the way to get people interested. I mean, why do we have a Fourth Amendment? The Fourth Amendment says very clearly there can be no unreasonable searches and seizures by federal police or any kind of federal officials of individual us, including in our homes. They can't be that way because to make a search, they have to go to a judge and get a warrant. Now, the Fourth Amendment is now, its life is hanging by a thread, and it happens again and again and again. They come into people's homes, they want to know what's on your hard drive. They already know because the telephone companies work with the government. They already know what phone calls you've been making. And I don't know how many people know about the National Security Agency.
Before we go there, Nat, I need your opinion on something.
Sure.
Do you believe, because we hear this debate a lot.
Wait, a little louder, please.
No problem. Do you believe in the Constitution? Do you believe in the elastic clause for our founding document? Or what is your opinion on this idea of strict constructionism? Is that actually a farce? Do the strict constructionists actually?
What I haven't heard that phrase in a long time. What is popular among some people is what Justice Antonin Scalia personifies. They call it originalist construction. In other words, whatever the words were at the time, you got to go by that. Despite the fact that people like Jefferson and Madison and the first important Supreme Court Justice John Marshall made it a point in his decisions to say, look, this is a document that keeps growing as we keep growing. I'll give you an example. How many of the founders knew about wiretapping? How many of them knew about telephones? But the strict constructionists, which they call themselves originalists, they say, oh no, whatever was happening then and couldn't happen then shouldn't happen now. And the prime example of that is Scalia, and unfortunately there are a lot of members of the Supreme Court now who agree with that. We have one of the weakest Supreme Courts in my memory in terms of individual. That's what it's all about. I mean, James Madison said, it's not for the government to censor us, it's up to us to censor the government because they work for us. How many people even think about that?
I agree. Well, who, in your mind, what would make in today's world a great Supreme Court justice? What are the ideals in this day and age that would make a great Supreme Court justice?
Well, first of all, you'd have to look at the record of the person who's being appointed. Increasingly, people are appointed from already district and more likely circuit courts, the second level of courts below the Supreme Court. They already have a record. And they themselves have been appointed by either Republican or Democratic presidents, and we usually follow the tenets of either one of those, and neither Republicans or Democratic presidents usually know what they're doing anyway in terms of the Constitution. What you're looking for, and I must say, of the recent nominations, Judge Sotomayor is the closest I would come to somebody who I'd appoint to the court. She grew up poor, Latino. She was a judge for a long time. She was also a prosecutor. She was a defense attorney. And, you know, she's read the Constitution. And you can see she sometimes in her questions during oral argument will differ from a lot of those people. But most of the people on the court now are as inadequate as you can imagine. We recently had a Supreme Court decision which pretty much destroyed the Fourth Amendment, and that was written by Justice Samuel Alito, and he's one of the worst people we've had in a long time.
I completely agree. Do you, please comment on Citizens United?
Citizens United was a very strange case.
That destroyed our country.
Not yet. Not yet. See, what was the way that was interpreted by people I know who ordinarily are very good on First Amendment. One of my guys I've known for years, Floyd Abrams, is a leading litigator before the Supreme Court. He approved of that decision. What's it called?
Citizens United.
Yeah. Even though the ACLU was dead fast against it. Going back to the first of these cases years ago, it was established by the Supreme Court that of all the free speech rights we have, political speech is the most important. Because otherwise, how can we ever change the government? Or
Exactly.
eventually the guy who's going to appoint people to support. Now, the Supreme Court went into that and somewhat farther when they said, okay, corporations claim that they're persons under the Constitution or under the law, but obviously a corporation is a corporation. But they based this on an earlier case, the Buckley case, which said that political speech is inviolate. You can contribute any amount of money to a candidate, but can a corporation or a political entity contribute any kind of money directly to a candidate? So the Supreme Court in Citizens United said corporations can contribute money, not directly to candidates, but that's just that if you know how to direct your money, you're obviously directing it to a candidate.
Exactly. It would be the equivalent of a slush fund.
Yeah.
The hot off the presses New York Times in Connecticut, you had the Governor Malloy sign a law that would mandate companies to pay sick leave for workers, extend protection to transgender people, charge in-state college tuition to illegal immigrants, extend early release programs for prisoners, and decriminalize small amounts of marijuana. Juxtapose that to Wisconsin with Governor Walker, the union busting, slashing of education. In your mind, which view of our state's powers will prevail?
In this Supreme Court, and that's the answer to it, because all of this is going to be appealed, and the ultimate decider are those 9 justices. I would think that the governor of Wisconsin's approach probably will win over the Connecticut approach, because this is not a Supreme Court that is all that hip on stopping the government from doing things that the founders never would have thought of. That's what I get a kick out of these originalist guys. Did they ever read Thomas Jefferson, who used to say, what we're setting up here is if the government goes farther and farther, we have a right to change the government. This court will never say that.
We had major social reform movements in the 30s and the Great Society under LBJ. Under our current class structure, do we have the ability to build consensus for another reform movement, or is it because they've stripped education out of the schools, people are ignorant and don't know any better?
I'll tell you the answer. I say the answer as if I had an absolute answer. The 2 things are encouraging me now. The lesser thing, because it's going to take a long time, more and more individual teachers and even a few school systems are beginning to realize, forget this nonsense of testing to the test, get the kids involved in knowing why they're Americans. And but a number of communities, actual school kids are involved in what's going on in the community. They can interrogate candidates, they can volunteer and all that stuff, but this is very minor compared to what it should be. The real thing that's going on now is a total feeling, except among a large number of people who are, to my surprise when I was a kid, there are conservatives like Bob Barr, who's a very conservative Republican.
From Georgia.
Well, he was, yeah. He's no longer in Congress. But Bob Barr has a recent post on his website called Barcode. He said it's time to get back the Bill of Rights. And then you've got, and this is a mixed bag, the Tea Partiers. The Tea Partiers are not a very strictly organized organization, but they claim to be constitutionalists. Some of them even have a constitution in their pockets when they're demonstrating. But what they're objecting to, and more people, without calling themselves Tea Partiers or even libertarians, which I am, are beginning to get very angry at a big government that begins to tell them what to do in all kinds of matters without going to a court, without giving them a chance to object. And one of the main reasons now we are getting deep and hostile skepticism to big government, and this crosses party lines when it works, is something Barack Obama did that unintentionally has awakened people to the fact, and it is a fact, that a government that exceeds its powers is violating the Constitution, especially when they start telling us how much, if you're under government finances, Medicare or Medicaid or whatever, they can tell you if what you need, either when you're elderly or even when you're not. Suppose you got a serious illness and you're on Medicare or Medicare or Medicaid, the government in Obamacare can tell you, no, I'm sorry, we can't pay for that. That has done a lot to alert people. They're not constitutionalists. They're afraid they're not going to live long. I have a personal interest in this. Tomorrow, I become 86 years old. I am on Medicare. I have certain, what I call indignities of age. I don't want a commission of bureaucrats who's never even seen me tell my doctor, oh, you can't do that. That costs too much money. This is the one thing that's happening, ironically, that has nothing to do with people studying the Constitution. It's because people are afraid. This is a government, increasingly, that makes people afraid that some guy they've never even seen before. In fact, the current guy whom Obama appointed, Dr. Berwick, he's in charge of the whole Medicare-Medicaid system. He has been quoted through the years as saying, and I use the word he uses, he's in love with the British system. The British system of health care is all state-controlled, and that's why there are more people there on waiting lists, no matter how serious their conditions are, and some die while they're on waiting lists because they can't show enough reason for the government to spend money on them. So oddly enough, and this is something the founders never could have imagined, Obamacare has done more to awaken a lot of people, not on the Constitution, but in self-defense. And that's
But
continuing.
This Obamacare was essentially a replica of a Bob Dole, Tom Daschle bill from the early 90s. Why is it demonized now? That was a middle-of-the-road consensus.
Well, you got to be louder. I heard the name, though. You gave me the magic name, not only Tom, but Bob Dole.
Dole and
Daschle. Let me finish.
Go ahead.
The biggest influence on Barack Obama in creating Obamacare was the man who was then the majority leader in the Senate, Tom Daschle. Daschle wrote a book, I have the book, which totally fell in love with the British system. And he converted Obama to that approach. Obamacare should be called Daschle Care. Now, as you know, Daschle had to leave that post because he had certain income tax problems. But every once in a while, he's in the White House still advising Obama. And I'll give you a quick story about this guy Daschle. He's so influential now. When the Patriot Act, which has done so much harm to the Constitution, was rushed through the Senate and the House, the Senate vote was something like 80-something to 1. The one was Russ Feingold. But before Feingold took the floor that night, he told his colleagues what he was going to do. Tom Daschle, then the Senate Majority Leader, held an immediate meeting of all the Democrats and said, don't you do what Feingold's going to do. We don't want to be considered soft on terrorism. See, this kind of not only ignorance of who we are, but fear fear of doing something that might lose them their job.
And who started that fear? I want your opinion on this. Did Osama bin Laden accomplish his goal of setting us in a path of total paranoia and fear?
You know, you have hit on, I think, a very strong point, because soon after the Patriot Act was passed, a number of people were saying, if we go ahead and do, Feingold, I wrote about it in my book, The War on the Bill of Rights. Feingold's statement when he was the one vote against the Patriot Act, pardon me, was a prediction of exactly what was going to happen. People would come into your homes without a warrant. People would put you on lists. This would be a surveillance society. It was like he was a prophet. And that is indeed what Osama bin Laden and all these other terrorists have accomplished. They've made not only the government so afraid of what might happen, and obviously you've got to have security, but if you're going to give away what we're all about, we've lost. I mean, we've lost in the sense that if we ever lose the country, this won't be it's increasingly not the country it was. And that's why I keep seizing on those signs that some people are waking up. They're not waking up because they read the Constitution, but they're afraid that Thomas Jefferson said something. Thomas Jefferson was not a conservative, but he warned against too big government, because he said if the government alone by itself can give you everything you want, the same government all by itself can take away everything you want.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you about civic leadership. In the middle part of last century, you had Frank Sinatra. You had other legendary figures, Joe DiMaggio. You had major figures and characters who were flawed, but yet they stood for things much larger than just their musical talent. They were being paid well, but they weren't being paid millions and millions of dollars based on one song. I look at somebody like Joe Henderson, one of the most phenomenal musicians, saxophonists of all time. He was a leader. Okay, how much has it been a failing? I don't want to be negative, Nat. I want you to talk about Joe Henderson and the leadership that he brought to not only jazz but to the black community in the 1960s.
Well, it's not only Joe Henderson. I would go farther than that.
Go right ahead.
Max Roach recorded, and I was privileged to be the A&R man, the Freedom Now suite. And that was just when the Freedom Rides were going down south, and we were all in the studio, and right afterwards, as soon as the record was released, it was on the Candid label, we were banned in South Africa, so we figured we'd done something. But no, it's not only Joe Henderson. All through the years, Duke Ellington used to tell me, he says, I'm writing about my people in these songs, in this music. And there were any number, the blues, if you listen to the blues singers carefully, they were talking about this society as well as their own blues, etc. Jazz has been a very awakening form of, I call it the spirit of this country. And I'm hoping it's going to come back now, because some of the younger players are beginning to understand that, and some of the older guys, it's something about the music that keeps a lot of guys going. They're still doing the same thing.
Well, I've been in heavy promotion mode. I do a lot of interviews with jazz legends, Pat Martino, Richard Davis.
Oh yeah.
All these guys, and I am actually Nat, I'm doing a lot of promotion to bring back these guys, not because a lot of them have played with a lot of younger guys, but I want to bring those individuals back to play together, because the spirit of the country, you're absolutely right, it is the spirit of the country, and people need to hear this kind of music again, not what they think jazz has become, which would be considered smooth jazz. I don't ever want people to believe that that's really what jazz is.
Oh, no, there are still people coming around. I mean, in my current book, At the Jazz Band Ball, I wrote about, when she first recorded, she's still a student at Berkeley, Haley Neiswanger, who's an alto saxophonist, wow as soon as she plays. And there are others like that coming along. So and along with the guys who are still here. My God, Sonny Rollins is still very strong. I'm glad you're doing that, because one thing I found out, I'll give you a quick story. Whenever I can get asked to a school to talk about jazz, I bring some records along and talk about the people I knew. And a few years ago, I was talking to a second-grade class here in New York, and I figured, what the hell? I brought along a New Orleans jazz set, George Lewis and his Stompers, and I told them a little about New Orleans and all the things that were going on when this started, and Congo Square and the like. And then I started playing, and the kids, after a while, got up and danced. And then the teacher got up and danced. Once you expose kids to this, they get very interested.
I am promoting, just for your information, Nat, in Los Angeles on July 14th and 15th, Heroes of Black Jazz, a tribute to Gene Russell. Gene Russell was a big promoter of black jazz in the early 70s, and he looked at guys like Calvin Keyes and Doug Karn and Carl Burnett and Henry Franklin, and he looked at those guys and he said, you have never had your day in the sun. You've never had a chance to cut an album.
I wish you'd mail me some information about that promotion. I'd like to write about it.
I would love to give it to you, because I've booked them 4 gigs, brought these guys back together after 40 years of dormancy. And they've been playing with other people, but I wanted to bring them back together.
Let me give you a story I've been working on that really surprised me. Quincy Jones has been working very hard for a long time to get music back into the schools, very much including jazz. The No Child Left Behind law started this nonsense of teachers teaching to the test. By the way, there are more standardized tests now than there ever were, and there are more coming. However, there's a superintendent of schools in Buffalo, New York. There, like every city in the country now, they're slashing the budgets, school budgets. This guy, his last name is Williams, he has set up an integrated curriculum of music and the rest of the studies, and he's told every principal, no matter what you cut, you cannot cut the money for music. And he gets a lot of jazz into it, and they play around. The kids get enthusiastic. They form bands, or they work in bands, etc. If we had somebody else like him and a few more school systems, it would be a lot beginning of what you and I are interested in. It shows you one guy can make a big difference.
Nat, one of the goals of the Jake Feinberg Show is to never allow the fine arts, specifically jazz, although some people would say they don't, like Gary Bartz, for instance, who played with Max Roach. He said that Max would go to blows if people said, we like how you play jazz. He said he never played jazz, he just played music.
Well, I'll tell you, my oldest friend in music, Charles Mingus, never used the word jazz. He said, I play Mingus music. And Duke Ellington, whom I also got to know when I was quite young, he was my mentor. He never used the term. He didn't like terminology. He gave me a lesson once when I was very young. He said, don't ever categorize. He was talking about music. He said, don't talk about cutting-edge jazz or old-time jazz or anything. You go for each musician, and you open yourself to what that particular player is telling you in his music. But the point is, as there ought to be more jazz in the schools.
Exactly. No, I will never allow the fine arts to be choked off in our society for as long as my show is on the radio. And I'm doing that through vinyl. I'm doing that, and I should just tell my audience that Nat Hentoff has written some amazing liner notes on Indian raga music. Nat, I just had Mary Khan and Alam Khan, Ali Akbar Khan's wife and son, on my program in an effort to raise awareness, because they are trying to raise money to build a public library to make sure they archive all of Ali's music. Nat,
let me tell you something about that. I used to know John Coltrane very well. He had the sense that music and everything he was doing was a world music, and he had to try to get into that world consciousness. He would listen for hours to not only Indian music, he was listening to African tribal music way back, which finally got recorded. And more of the younger musicians, some of them anyway, are beginning to realize how it all becomes part of the will to be yourself, collectively and individually. And that's why that they were bringing these people on is very important, because the more you hear what other cultures have done in music, it shows why music is still, by the way, in many countries here, is a form of therapy. Louis Armstrong, or the Louis Armstrong Educational Fund, Louis started it, has started music therapy at a number of hospitals, especially here in New York, all through the hospital, from people who are pregnant to people who are in last years of life. And it's just inspiring to see the effect that music has, including, my own bias here, jazz.
Mm-hmm. How did you, as somebody who did not play these types of Indian instruments, how did you write such cogent, linear notes for somebody to? Because when I listen, I'll give you an example of what you're just talking about. If I'm having a tough day as I teach the visually impaired. If I'm having a tough day or I have a lot of anxiety, I throw on some of these Indian albums, and because of the time signatures and the different time codes they're playing in, it really relaxes my brain. And then I read the liner notes, and it was written by Nat Hentoff.
Well, you know something? You're giving me too much credit on one score. I can't tell you one chord from the other.
Me neither.
and technically, I'm very limited. I try to study theory for a while. What I do on the liner notes, and I've always done this, where does the music come from? From the musician and himself, his life, what he wanted to say in the music. So my liner notes, like my books on music, essentially are what the musicians tell me. So I'm not a critic, I'm a reporter. And I talk to these people just like, you would talk to somebody at a bar even. We get into a conversation. And I couldn't tell you, again, one chord from the other, but I think my liner notes have been useful because you can hear what each player has to say.
To the best of your knowledge or your memory, like, for instance, you would write for Connoisseur Society and then also Blue Note. Was it private would they just call you up and say, hey, Nat, we need you to write these notes on this album? How would that work?
No, it always worked the same way. These guys knew me. They'd say, if I knew the musician, and I knew him, and I liked him, and I knew I would get excited. See, my whole thing is, once I put on a recording, if I know somebody or I don't know somebody, the first few bars get to me, I'll get up and shout or something. So if I knew the player and they say sure, I would say sure. If it was somebody I didn't know or wasn't sure about, I'd say I can't do the notes until you send me the album, and then we'll see. And years ago, I learned something about this, although I didn't know I was learning it at the time, from Charlie Parker. I was doing a radio interview with Bird, and he was talking about, he said he'd heard a Bartók concerto once, and he thought it was very dull. But then he heard it again 2 months later, and it woke him up. And he said to me, I decided I was going to write something in jazz with that kind of framework. He said, the thing is, don't always go by the first reaction you get to music. Listen again. So I'm very careful to do that. But in terms of liner notes, I don't write any. I've turned down a lot of offers for liner notes. If I don't get moved, how can I expect the reader to? And so I only do the notes of people I really get moved by.
I wanted to just, we're joined here by Nat Hentoff, and Nat, I really appreciate you taking the time. Are you feeling that you can continue for a little while, or would you like
maybe a little while? If I didn't mention it, tomorrow I'm 86 years old.
You did mention it, and happy birthday, and I want to just tell you...
Well, I'll be working all day. That's how I stay alive.
You keep working, and you keep working with the Jake Feinberg Show, too, my friend. I want you to be a part of my show. I wanted to ask you, before we go, about a couple of guys. One of them was Rudy Van Gelder.
Oh, yeah.
Was he someone, from what I gather, he was an ophthalmologist by day, and then he would go into the studio and he loved the technical part and the sound. But was he also, did he understand did he understand or grasp the musicians that were coming into his studio?
I'll tell you, the way I can answer that is, I got, for a while he did Prestige label and others, and so I got to know a lot of the musicians who went out to New Jersey there, and almost without exception, they were very happy to have him as an engineer because they felt that he understood what they were doing and how they wanted to. In other words, the musicians became part of the apparatus. He was very careful, and he'd play back. He would listen to what they had to say, and then they would listen to what he had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in studios. In fact, even when I was briefly an A&R man, when the engineers or the producers would get in the way of the music. I remember I was once recording a singer, and the engineer said, she has to have her own mic and a kind of a baffle. I said, no, she doesn't. She has to hear the other musicians, and they have to hear her. But the thing about Van Gelder was he never wrote much or said much, but he was really organically involved not only in the technical process of sound, but he understood and felt what these... You can't record Coltrane and Monk and those people and care about it and not get thrown into what they're saying. And as an engineer, he was able to make that multidimensionally clear.
What are you working on? You still write a lot about civil rights? You write about...
Well, I tell you what I do.
Go ahead.
I have to write something on jazz because what I write about on the syndicate I write for, that reaches about 200 papers, and also at Cato Institute, which is a libertarian place that I now work. Every once in a while, things get so depressing that I'm writing about, I have to stop and put on, let's say, James Moody, although he didn't use the word James,
mm-hmm.
or Duke, or
Dizzy Gillespie.
Or Dizzy, of all the people I've known, Dizzy was the most open and gracious and really extraordinary human being I've ever known. And I'll leave you with a story that it's very self-serving, but I can't resist. We got to know each other very well. And one day I was going to cover, he was putting together an orchestra for a UN concert, and I got there fairly early. The guys were in the studio, but he wasn't. And I saw Dizzy coming down the corridor with a friend of his, and he saw me, and he came rushing over, gave me a big hug, and he said to the friend, gee, it's like seeing your old broad or something. Well, nobody's given me an award like that.
Nat, I'm going to send you information about my promotions for the Black Jazz Tribute in Los Angeles. And
send me a lot about yourself. I want to have some bio. And if it's possible, if I could get a transcript of this, I'd appreciate that too.
Yeah, I will send you a CD, and I will also transcribe the interview.
And also, if you're doing much or thinking of doing much of getting the music into the schools,
I want to do it. I'm committed to that. I am absolutely committed to working with people of like mind to be able to get this music into the ears of students. They need to hear it in their ears.
See, I'll leave you with this. I've just finished the first part of a series I'm doing for Jazz Times. I'm in there every month. For years I've been writing about, there are various cities around the country where they have jazz societies that try to get people aware of the roots of jazz in those cities, like St. Louis, let's say, or Cleveland, or the state of Washington. And the societies try to get gigs for jazz musicians. But the one place where I grew up, I was part of the Boston jazz scene from, let's see, 1940 to 1953. There's never been anything like that. Now I find out there's one that started 5 years ago called Jazz Boston. That's astonishing. They've gotten into schools, into all kinds of places. They get gigs for musicians, and they give an annual award called the Roy Haynes Award.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first person to get this was Roy. So I'll leave you with my story about me and Roy. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at a place called the Savoy in Boston. Later on, I did remotes from there when I had a radio show. But on Sundays, they had jam sessions. And one afternoon, Edmund Hall, the clarinetist, was leading the band, and a kid came up. He looked to be about 15 years old, wanted to know if he could sit in. Edmund said, sure. Kid gets up on drums. Wow! He swung the whole place. Turned out to be a kid named Roy Haynes. And years later, when they had jazz masters at the National Endowment for the Arts, Roy and I were sitting together, and I reminded him of that. And he said, when I was a kid, I used to listen to you on the radio in Boston. So I'm thinking that's the kind of link. Two Boston boys linked by jazz for the rest of their lives. And more kids, if they get to hear this music, they'll consider this something they have to have. You never get enough of it.
Nat Hentoff, happy birthday, and I look forward to having you again back on the Jake Feinberg Show real soon.
Well, I want to know more about you, because I think you're going to be a very important spreader of the joy of jazz.
You're passing the torch, and we're gonna do it together, my friend. Thank you so much. Happy birthday, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.